May 19, 1945, Dresden, Germany. The city stood in ruins, its Baroque splendor reduced to skeletal facades and mountains of rubble that lined what once were streets. Lieutenant David Miller of the United States Strategic Services Unit stood at the window of his makeshift office, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape. In 48 hours, he would begin his most important mission yet, infiltrating a suspected network of former German intelligence officers who were believed to be hiding valuable scientific documents. Little did he know that the woman he would soon meet would change everything he thought he understood about loyalty, truth, and the human capacity for deception. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true story of how one American intelligence officer's search for enemy secrets led him into the arms of a woman whose own secrets would prove far more dangerous than any classified document. A tale that reveals how the most powerful weapon in the aftermath of war was not found in any arsenal, but in the devastating power of truth withheld. The rain fell steadily as David made his way through the rubble-strewn streets. Dresden, in 1945, was a city of ghosts, where elegant buildings once stood. Now only fragments remained, their broken facades staring out like the hollow eyes of skulls. At 27 years old, David was younger than most of his colleagues in intelligence work, but his background in European history and his fluency in German had made him invaluable to the Strategic Services Unit, the successor to the wartime Office of Strategic Services. Your papers show you're David Müller, a German-American liaison officer helping with reconstruction efforts, said Colonel James Donovan, his supervisor, during their final briefing. Your cover story is that you're here to evaluate which German scientists might be valuable to American interests. In reality, you're looking for anyone connected to Operation Paperclip's missing files, particularly the ones concerning the rocket scientists from Peenemünde. Intelligence suggests some of them are being hidden by the widow of Oberst Wilhelm Braun, a high-ranking German intelligence officer. Do we have information on the widow? David asked, studying the sparse file before him. Elise Braun, 30 years old, educated at the University of Berlin. Her husband was eliminated in the final weeks of the conflict after being implicated in various intelligence operations. She's living in the relatively intact district of Striesen, in a house requisitioned by the American forces, but partially left to her use due to her claim of having American relatives. She speaks excellent English and has been cooperative with occupation authorities so far. David examined the grainy photograph attached to the file. Even in the poor quality image, Elise Braun's beauty was evident: high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and an expression that seemed both vulnerable and determined. What makes us think she has access to these files? David asked. Her husband was deeply involved in the program to protect German scientific knowledge from capture. 3 scientists who worked under him have vanished, along with their research. Before his death, Wilhelm Braun was observed visiting a bank vault repeatedly. After he was gone, the vault was empty when our people checked it. The widow is our best lead. And my approach? Sympathy, Lieutenant Miller. These German women have lost everything: their husbands, their homes, their country's future. They're desperate for security, for kindness. Your German heritage makes you less threatening. Be charming, gain her trust, find those files. David nodded, uncomfortable with the manipulation, but understanding its necessity. The scientific knowledge developed by German researchers could be dangerous in the wrong hands, particularly with tensions already developing between the Americans and the Soviets. 3 days later, David accidentally encountered Elise Braun at the provisional market that had been established near the center of Dresden. He helped her carry her meager rations after noticing her struggling with a heavy bag, and their conversation flowed naturally. Her English was indeed excellent, with only the slightest German accent. She had the weary dignity that David had observed in many Europeans who had once lived comfortable lives before the war reduced them to scrambling for basic necessities. "You're very kind, Lieutenant Miller," she said as they approached her home, a once grand townhouse now partially damaged but still standing. Americans have a reputation for generosity, but few take the time to help an individual German woman. "My mother was German," David replied, using his cover story. "From Heidelberg. I grew up hearing German lullabies and eating her strudel. It's impossible for me to see the German people as enemies, especially now that the conflict is over." Something flickered in Elise's eyes, a momentary calculation that David nearly missed. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Real tea is impossible to find, of course, but I have some herbs from my garden that make a pleasant enough substitute. David accepted, noting the strategic opportunity, while finding himself genuinely curious about this composed widow surviving amidst the chaos of defeated Germany. Elise's home revealed much about her. Despite the shortages and destruction, she had maintained an island of civilization. Bookshelves lined the walls of her sitting room, filled with volumes in German, English, and French. A piano stood in one corner, its lid closed but its surface polished. The furnishings were quality pieces that had clearly been in the family for generations. "You've maintained quite a home here," David commented, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "This was my parents' house before they passed," she explained. "Wilhelm and I moved here after our apartment was destroyed in the early bombing raids. The American colonel who requisitioned it has kindly allowed me to keep several rooms for myself." That was decent of him. Decent, yes, though perhaps not entirely altruistic. Something in her tone hinted at unpleasant exchanges with the colonel. "But you're different from the others, aren't you, Lieutenant Müller? You see beyond uniforms and flags." David chose his words carefully. "I believe in judging individuals, not nations. The actions of governments don't always reflect the hearts of their people." "A generous philosophy," Elise replied, studying him with intelligent eyes that seemed to search for deception. "My husband would have agreed with you. He was a soldier, yes, but a historian by education. He understood that history is written by individual choices, as much as by grand forces." "What kind of history did he study?" David asked, probing gently. "Medieval European manuscripts originally. Before the war changed everyone's priorities." Her expression grew distant. "Wilhelm was a complicated man, brilliant, dedicated to knowledge. When he was conscripted, he tried to serve in ways that would preserve cultural treasures rather than destroy them." David recognized the narrative many Germans were constructing in the aftermath of defeat, recasting their roles to emphasize distance from the regime's worst aspects. Still, something in Elise's demeanor struck him as genuine. Their conversation continued through another cup of herb tea, touching on their mutual interest in history, books they had both read, and carefully skirting the immediate past. As David prepared to leave, he took a calculated risk. "I work with the department overseeing the protection of scientific knowledge," he said. "If your husband was involved with preserving cultural artifacts, perhaps you know of colleagues of his with similar interests. I'm particularly interested in ensuring that important research doesn't get lost in the chaos." Elise's face remained composed, but David noticed her fingers tightening slightly on her teacup. "I know very little of Wilhelm's professional associates," she said. "He was discreet about his work, especially toward the end. Of course. But if you happen to remember anything, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know. Knowledge belongs to humanity, not to any single nation." She nodded, accompanying him to the door. "Perhaps we could continue our conversation another time, Lieutenant. It's rare to find someone who appreciates the value of the past these days." "I'd like that very much," David replied, and was surprised to realize he meant it sincerely. Over the following weeks, David and Elise established a routine. He would visit her home every few days, bringing small luxuries when he could: real coffee once, a bar of chocolate another time, paper for her to write on. Their conversations grew increasingly comfortable, ranging from literature to music to philosophy. David found himself impressed by her intellect and her resilience in the face of devastating circumstances. Colonel Donovan grew impatient with the slow progress. "You've been seeing the Braun widow for nearly a month now, Lieutenant. Where are the results? Have you found any evidence of the missing files or the scientists?" "I'm building trust," David explained. "She's intelligent and cautious. Pushing too hard would only make her suspicious. I believe she knows something, but she won't share it until she's certain of my intentions." What David didn't share with his superior was how Elise had begun to affect him personally. Her quiet dignity, her struggle to maintain civilization amid ruins, and her thoughtful insights had awakened feelings he hadn't expected. He told himself his growing attachment was simply a byproduct of the intimate nature of intelligence work, but in his more honest moments, he recognized it was something more. On a warm June evening, as they walked through a small park that had somehow survived the destruction relatively intact, Elise suddenly took David's hand. "I need to ask you something, David, and I need you to be honest," she said, her voice serious. "What happens to German scientists who work with Americans? Are they treated as prisoners, tried as criminals, or are they given new lives?" The directness of her question caught David off guard. This was the opening he had been waiting for, yet now that it had arrived, he felt a strange reluctance. "It depends on their area of expertise and their past actions," he answered carefully. "Those with valuable knowledge who weren't involved in atrocities are often offered positions in American research facilities. They and their families can build new lives in the United States." Elise nodded, seeming to come to a decision. Wilhelm had friends, brilliant men who wanted nothing to do with creating weapons, but were forced into such work. Before he died, he helped some of them hide both themselves and their research. He believed their knowledge could benefit humanity in peacetime, but in the wrong hands, it might only extend suffering. "And do you know where these men are now?" David asked, his heart racing despite his outwardly calm demeanor. "Not exactly," she replied, "but I know where Wilhelm kept records, names, locations of document caches. I've been afraid to access this information, uncertain what would happen to these men and their families if I revealed it. I can promise you that any scientist not directly implicated in crimes would be treated fairly," David said, carefully navigating between his mission and his growing feelings for Elise. "America is primarily interested in the knowledge, not in punishment." She studied his face for a long moment. "I believe you, David. You've been kind when you had no reason to be. Tomorrow, I'll show you what I know." That night, David sent a coded message to Colonel Donovan. "Subject prepared to share critical information. Expect significant developments within 24 hours." The following morning, Elise led David to a church on the outskirts of Dresden that had survived the bombing with minimal damage. The elderly priest greeted Elise warmly and, after a brief, whispered conversation, led them to a small office behind the sanctuary. "Father Hoffman was an old friend of my family," Elise explained. "When Wilhelm realized he was under suspicion in the final weeks, he entrusted certain items to the church's safekeeping. The priest unlocked an old cabinet and removed a wooden box, approximately 30 centimeters square. 'This belongs to Frau Braun,' he said simply, placing it on the desk before withdrawing to give them privacy. Elise opened the box to reveal several notebooks, a collection of microfilm rolls, and a set of keys with tags attached. "These contain the information about the scientists' locations and their research repositories," she explained. Wilhelm organized everything methodically. Each key corresponds to a different storage location, with the microfilm providing inventories of the contents. David examined the materials with mounting excitement. This was exactly what his mission had been seeking: a comprehensive map to the scattered scientific knowledge that both American and Soviet intelligence were desperately trying to secure. "Elise, this is remarkable. These men and their work will be properly protected now." She met his eyes with an intensity that caught him off guard. "You promise they'll be treated well? That their research will be used for peaceful purposes?" The question placed David in an impossible position. He couldn't guarantee how all this knowledge would ultimately be applied. The reality of the emerging cold conflict with the Soviets meant that much of it would likely find military applications. Yet looking into Elise's earnest face, he couldn't bring himself to shatter her hope. "I promise to do everything in my power to ensure they're treated with dignity and that their work benefits humanity," he said, choosing his words with care. Something in his expression must have conveyed his sincerity, because Elise nodded slowly. "Then I've made the right choice in trusting you." As they prepared to leave the church with the precious materials, Elise suddenly placed her hand on David's arm. "There's something else you should know. My situation here becomes more precarious each day. The colonel who controls my house has made it clear that my continued residence depends on my cooperation with his demands." She spoke the words with quiet dignity, but David could see the fear and revulsion beneath her composed exterior. "So that's unacceptable," David said, anger flaring at the implied threat. "I can report him to whom? He outranks most officers in the area, and a German widow has no voice in today's Dresden." She took a deep breath. "I have a favor to ask, one that may seem strange given the circumstances. If I've helped your mission, might you help me in return? Could you arrange for me to go to America as well? I have distant relatives in New York, though I've never met them." The request shouldn't have surprised David, yet somehow it did. He had been so focused on obtaining the intelligence that he hadn't fully considered Elise's future. Looking at her now, brave, intelligent, and utterly vulnerable in the chaos of post-war Germany, he made a decision that would alter both their lives. "There might be another way," he said, "a more immediate solution that would also facilitate getting you to America." Elise looked at him questioningly. "Marriage to an American officer would give you protected status immediately and simplify immigration tremendously." Her eyes widened. "Are you suggesting—" "Yes," David said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Marry me, Elise." For the first time since he'd known her, Elise Braun looked completely taken aback. "This is unexpected. We barely know each other. I know you're intelligent, resilient, and principled. You know I'm trustworthy enough to share your husband's most closely guarded secrets. Many marriages start with less." He took her hands in his. "It would be a practical arrangement, of course. Once we're in America, you could decide if you wish to continue it or establish your independence." Elise was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she squeezed his hands gently. "You continue to surprise me, Lieutenant Müller. Or should I say, David Miller? Yes, I know your real name and purpose. I've known for some time." It was David's turn to be shocked. "How?" A small, sad smile crossed her face. "My husband was an intelligence officer for 6 years. He taught me to recognize certain patterns, certain inconsistencies. Your German is excellent, but occasionally you use American idioms directly translated. And you were a bit too interested in Wilhelm's professional connections from our very first meeting. Yet you still decided to trust me with this information. I decided to trust the man beneath the cover story, the one who helps women with their market bags and brings chocolate to a widow when he could use such luxuries to buy information elsewhere." She took a deep breath. "Yes, David Miller, I will marry you. For practicality, for safety, for a new beginning. But no marriage, even one of convenience, should begin with secrets between us. So now you know mine. I recognized your deception from the start." David felt a complex mixture of professional chagrin and personal admiration. Elise had essentially been running a counterintelligence operation on him while he thought he was manipulating her. Yet instead of anger, he felt a deepening respect for her capabilities. "I suppose we're both more than we appear to be," he said finally. "Aren't we all?" She replied, "especially after what the world has just endured." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, in the same church where Elise had revealed the hidden documents. Father Hoffman performed the simple ceremony, with 2 American soldiers as witnesses. David had explained the situation to Colonel Donovan, who, after initially berating him for becoming personally involved with an asset, ultimately approved the marriage as an expedient way to bring both the intelligence materials and a potentially valuable source to American soil. "Just remember where your loyalties lie, Lieutenant," Donovan warned. "Romantic notions are luxury items in our line of work. The information she's provided checks out so far, but that doesn't mean there aren't deeper games being played." The warning lingered in David's mind as he and Elise exchanged vows, but looking at her, composed and beautiful in a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, he found it hard to maintain his professional skepticism. Whatever her initial motives for cooperating, they were now bound together, sailing into an uncertain future. 3 days after the ceremony, they boarded a military transport plane bound for London, the first leg of their journey to the United States. As the aircraft climbed above the devastated German landscape, Elise gripped David's hand tightly. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No. Only memories. Good and bad ones. It's strange to think I may never see this land again. You might, someday, when the wounds of war have healed more. Perhaps. She turned to look at him directly. Thank you, David. Whatever happens next, thank you for this chance at a new life. He squeezed her hand in response, struck by the realization that in fulfilling his mission, he had committed himself to a far more personal obligation than he had ever anticipated. In London, they stayed for 2 weeks while final arrangements were made for their passage to America. David was debriefed extensively about the information Elise had provided, which was proving to be even more valuable than initially believed. The documents and microfilm contained not only the locations of 3 key German scientists who had gone into hiding, but also comprehensive research on advanced aircraft designs, synthetic fuel production, and medical techniques developed during the war years. During their time in London, David observed how Elise adapted to each new situation with remarkable poise. She charmed the British officers they encountered, showed genuine fascination with the city despite its battle scars, and began to speak of our future with a natural ease that sometimes made David forget their marriage had begun as a pragmatic arrangement. They arrived in New York in late July 1945, stepping onto American soil as husband and wife. For Elise, it was a moment of visible emotion, her first glimpse of the country that would now be her home. For David, it marked the successful completion of his European assignment and the beginning of a new phase that filled him with both anticipation and uncertainty. The Strategic Services Unit arranged for them to stay in a comfortable apartment in Washington, D.C., where David would continue to work with intelligence officials, analyzing the materials Elise had brought from Germany. Elise, meanwhile, began the process of adjusting to American life, learning about rationing systems that, while strict by American standards, seemed generous compared to starving Europe, navigating social customs and establishing a home for them. "You're remarkably adaptable," David commented one evening, watching as Elise prepared dinner in their small kitchen, somehow managing to create an appealing meal from basic rations. She smiled over her shoulder at him. "Adaptability is how one survives, David. I've had practice." In those early weeks, they established a comfortable domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural. They maintained separate bedrooms, honoring the provisional nature of their arrangement, but spent their evenings together, talking, listening to the radio, or reading in companionable silence. David found himself increasingly drawn to Elise's quiet strength, her intelligence, and the glimpses of humor that emerged as she became more secure in her new surroundings. By September, David had been permanently assigned to a new intelligence division focused on scientific developments, a position that allowed him to remain in Washington rather than being sent overseas again. The information Elise had provided had led to the successful recruitment of 2 German physicists and a chemist, all of whom were now working at American research facilities. "Your husband's foresight has proven invaluable," David's new supervisor, Dr. Harold Jenkins, told him during a briefing. "These scientists might have fallen into Soviet hands, or worse, their research might have been lost entirely. Instead, they're continuing their work under optimal conditions. The woman deserves our gratitude." "Her name is Elise," David said, a protective edge entering his voice. "And yes, she does." Dr. Jenkins gave him a measured look. "Of course, Mrs. Miller has been cooperative with all our inquiries, though there are still some questions about her husband's activities during the final year of the conflict. Wilhelm Braun's role in certain intelligence operations remains unclear." "Elise has shared everything she knows," David replied firmly. "She was not privy to all her husband's activities. Naturally, still we'll need to conduct a few more interviews with her, standard procedure." David nodded, though the request left him uneasy. He knew the intelligence community's tendency to probe and probe again, looking for inconsistencies or hidden information. The thought of Elise being subjected to repeated questioning bothered him more than it should have from a purely professional standpoint. That evening, he mentioned the upcoming interviews to Elise as they sat in their small living room after dinner. She received the news with characteristic composure. "I expected as much," she said. "Your colleagues have been polite but persistent." They circle back to the same questions about Wilhelm's activities in 1944, particularly his trips to Switzerland. Were there aspects of those trips you haven't disclosed? David asked carefully. Elise's eyes met his directly. I've told them what I know. Wilhelm visited Swiss banks several times that year. He never explained the specific purpose, but I gathered it involved securing certain assets against the eventuality of Germany's defeat, which he foresaw earlier than many. She set down her teacup. David, may I ask you something? These past months, our arrangement has evolved into something I value deeply. Whatever began as practicality has become, more at least for me. Before these new interviews begin, I need to know. Where do you see our future leading? The directness of her question caught David off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They had been living as husband and wife in name for nearly 3 months. The comfortable domesticity they had established had begun to feel less like a cover story and more like a genuine life together. Looking at Elise now, elegant even in the simple American clothes she had adopted, her expression open and vulnerable, David acknowledged to himself what he had been increasingly unable to deny. I see a future where this marriage becomes real in every sense, he said quietly, if that's what you want as well. The smile that illuminated her face was like sunrise breaking over the horizon. It is what I want, David. Very much. That night, for the first time, they shared the same bed, their physical connection as natural and right as the emotional bond that had been growing between them. Afterward, as Elise slept beside him, David marveled at the strange path that had led them to this moment, from the ruins of Dresden to a new beginning in America, from strategic manipulation to genuine love. The following weeks passed in a haze of newfound intimacy and deepening connection. David felt as though he was truly getting to know Elise for the first time, not as an intelligence asset or even as a convenient spouse, but as a woman with dreams, fears, and a complex inner life. She spoke more openly about her childhood in Berlin, her university studies in literature, and her complicated relationship with Wilhelm, whom she had married partly out of genuine affection and partly due to family expectations. He was 15 years older than me, she explained one evening. Brilliant, established, from a good family. My parents were delighted with the match. Wilhelm was kind in his way, but always somewhat remote. His work consumed him, especially as the conflict progressed. Were you happy with him? David asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, that's not fair to ask. No, it's natural to wonder. Elise considered for a moment. I was content, for the most part. Wilhelm respected my intelligence, gave me freedom to pursue my interests. He wasn't a passionate man, but he was never cruel. In many ways, I was fortunate compared to other women I knew. But what we have now, David, this is different. This is what I imagine when I think of happiness. Her words filled David with a profound sense of rightness, of having found something precious amid the chaos and destruction of war. Yet even as their personal relationship flourished, external pressures continued to intrude. The additional interviews with intelligence officers proceeded as scheduled, with Elise answering questions about Wilhelm's activities with patient detail. David, excluded from these sessions due to his personal connection, waited anxiously each time, relieved when she returned home apparently untroubled by the experience. They seem particularly interested in a period in October 1944, she told him after one such session. Wilhelm made 3 trips to Switzerland that month. They keep asking if he ever mentioned specific banks or account numbers. And did he? David asked. Not to me, though he did bring back a gift that last time, a silver bracelet with my initials engraved inside. He said it was to remind me that some beautiful things would survive the conflict, even if many did not. A shadow passed over her face. He knew by then that Germany would be defeated. I think he was already preparing for what would come after, trying to secure whatever he could. November brought news that the scientists located through Elise's information had made significant breakthroughs in their respective fields. David's stock rose accordingly within the agency, and there was talk of a promotion. Their personal happiness and professional success seemed to be aligning perfectly. Then, in early December, everything changed with the arrival of a single document on Dr. Jenkins' desk, a report from an American intelligence officer, who had been investigating Swiss bank records used by German officials during the final years of the conflict. Dr. Jenkins summoned David to his office late one afternoon. "Lieutenant Miller, we've received some disturbing information regarding Wilhelm Braun's activities," he said without preamble. "Information that potentially implicates your wife." David felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What kind of information? Evidence suggesting that Oberst Braun was not merely hiding scientists and research materials in those final months. He appears to have been deeply involved in moving looted assets, artwork, gold, currency, through Swiss financial institutions. Assets taken from civilians who were rounded up by German authorities. "That's not possible," David said automatically. "Elise would have known. She would have told us." Dr. Jenkins slid a folder across the desk. "These are photographs from a bank in Zurich. That's Wilhelm Braun entering the vault area in October 1944. And that, Lieutenant Miller, is your wife accompanying him." David stared at the grainy but unmistakable image of Elise, elegantly dressed, following her first husband into the secure area of a Swiss bank. The date stamp showed October 23, 1944, exactly the period the intelligence officers had been questioning her about, the very trips she had claimed to know little about, beyond receiving a silver bracelet. "There must be an explanation," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "I sincerely hope so, for your sake as well as hers. We'll need to bring her in for more intensive questioning tomorrow morning. Until then, say nothing of this to her. That's an order, Lieutenant. This is now a matter of potential war crimes proceeds, not just scientific intelligence." David left the office in a daze, the folder's contents seared into his memory. The woman he had come to love, the woman he had married and brought to America, had lied to him, had lied to everyone, about her knowledge of her first husband's activities. The silver bracelet she still occasionally wore might have been purchased with wealth stolen from innocent victims. As he walked home through the December chill, David's mind raced through all their conversations, all the moments of seeming openness and vulnerability. Had it all been calculated? Was their entire relationship built on an elaborate deception? Or was there some explanation that could reconcile the photographic evidence with the woman he thought he knew? When he arrived at their apartment, Elise was preparing dinner, humming softly to herself as she moved about the kitchen. She smiled when she saw him coming to kiss him in greeting, but then stopped, noticing his expression. "David, what's wrong?" He looked into her concerned face, seeing only the woman he had grown to love, unable to reconcile that image with the disturbing questions now plaguing him. Tomorrow would bring official interrogation, potential charges, perhaps even deportation if the worst suspicions proved true. But tonight, he faced a more immediate and personal dilemma: whether to defy orders and confront her with what he had learned, or spend what might be their final peaceful evening together, carrying this terrible knowledge alone. "Nothing," he said finally, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at the office. Something smells wonderful." "Pot roast," she replied, though her eyes still held concern. "Not quite like my mother used to make, but I'm learning to adapt American ingredients." "You always do adapt, don't you?" he said, the words carrying a weight Elise couldn't possibly understand. "No matter what the circumstances." "It's how we survive," she answered, echoing her words from months earlier. "Come, help me set the table. Tell me about your day." As David went through the motions of their domestic routine, placing plates and silverware on the small dining table, he wondered what dark truths might be hidden behind the composed exterior of the woman he had married, and whether tomorrow would bring answers that could heal or destroy the life they had built together. David barely slept that night. Beside him, Elise breathed the deep, steady rhythm of untroubled rest, while his mind churned with questions he couldn't ask and doubts he couldn't resolve. The photograph he had seen in Dr. Jenkins' office played on endless repeat behind his closed eyelids. Elise following Wilhelm into that Swiss bank vault, her elegant profile unmistakable despite the grainy quality of the surveillance image. When morning finally came, David rose early, careful not to wake her. Standing at their apartment window, watching as dawn gradually illuminated the Washington skyline, he tried to prepare himself for what lay ahead. In a few hours, Elise would be called in for questioning. The comfortable life they had been building together might shatter before the day was done. Elise found him there, still staring out the window, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. "You didn't come to bed until very late," she said, coming to stand beside him. "And now you're up with the sun. Something is troubling you, David. Please tell me what it is." He turned to look at her, this woman who had become the center of his world in just a few months. Her hair was tousled from sleep, her face free of makeup, her eyes concerned as they studied his expression. In that moment, despite everything, he couldn't imagine her knowingly participating in the crimes Wilhelm Braun was suspected of committing. "There will be another interview today," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "A more formal one. Some new information has come to light about your first husband's activities." Wariness entered her expression. "What kind of information?" David hesitated, torn between his professional obligation to follow orders and his personal need for truth from the woman he loved. Evidence that Wilhelm was involved in transferring assets through Swiss banks in 1944. Assets that may have been confiscated from civilians. He watched her face closely, looking for shock, guilt, fear, any reaction that might confirm or dispel his suspicions. What he saw instead was a subtle shift in her posture, a squaring of her shoulders, as though she were preparing to bear a weight she had long expected to fall upon her. "I see," she said quietly. "And they believe I was complicit in this." "Were you?" The question escaped before he could stop it, direct and uncompromising. Elise met his gaze steadily. "They have photographs, don't they? Of me at the bank with Wilhelm." The calmness of her response struck David like a physical blow. "You knew such photographs existed?" "I suspected they might. The Swiss were never as neutral as they claimed to be. They worked with both sides, keeping records as insurance." She sighed, a sound of deep weariness. "Yes, David. I was with Wilhelm at the Zurich Credit Bank in October 1944. 3 times to be precise. And yes, I knew what he was doing there, though not all the details." "Why didn't you tell me? Why lie to the investigators?" "Because the truth is complicated, and I feared neither you nor your colleagues would believe it. Or worse, that you would believe but wouldn't care. Because the actual truth didn't serve American interests as neatly as a simpler narrative." Before David could press further, the telephone rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that made them both flinch. He answered it, already knowing who would be on the line. "Lieutenant Miller, Dr. Jenkins here. We need Mrs. Miller to come in immediately. A car will be at your residence in 30 minutes. "Understood, sir." David hung up and turned back to Elise. "They're sending a car." She nodded, her expression grave but composed. "Then I should dress appropriately for this interview. Something tells me it may be a long day." As Elise went to prepare herself, David was struck by her lack of panic, of desperate explanations or tearful pleas. Whatever secret she had been carrying, she seemed almost relieved that it was finally coming to light. When the car arrived, David insisted on accompanying her to the agency headquarters, though he knew he would not be permitted to participate in the questioning. In the back seat, he reached for her hand, finding it cool and steady in his grasp. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "remember that I love you." Elise's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Even now, when you're not sure who I really am?" "I know who you are," David replied, surprising himself with the certainty he felt despite his doubts. "What I don't know is the full story of what you've done. There's a difference." At headquarters, they were separated almost immediately. David was directed to Dr. Jenkins's office while Elise was escorted to an interview room elsewhere in the building. The hours that followed were among the most agonizing of David's life. Worse than combat, worse than the dangerous intelligence operations he had conducted during the conflict. Then at least he had been able to act. Now he could only wait, imagining what Elise might be saying, what evidence they might be presenting to her, what consequences might follow. Dr. Jenkins offered little information. "The questioning is being conducted by specialists, Lieutenant. We'll know more when they've completed their assessment." "She's not a security risk," David insisted. "Whatever her involvement with Wilhelm's activities, Elise has been nothing but helpful since coming to America." "That remains to be determined," Jenkins replied neutrally. "I suggest you use this time to prepare yourself for various possible outcomes. Your own judgment in this matter is obviously compromised by your personal relationship." The hours stretched on. Noon came and went. By mid-afternoon, David had worn a path in the carpet of Jenkins' outer office, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything but the closed door behind which decisions about Elise's fate, and by extension his own, were being made. Finally, at just after 4 o'clock, the door opened. A grey-haired man David recognized as Colonel Lewis Masterson, one of the highest-ranking intelligence officials in the department, emerged. "Lieutenant Miller," Masterson said, "we'd like you to join us now." David followed him through a maze of corridors to a conference room where Elise sat at a long table, a glass of water before her posture still remarkably composed, though weariness showed at the corners of her eyes. Several senior officials were also present, their expressions unreadable. "Please sit down, Lieutenant." Masterson indicated a chair across from Elise. "Your wife has spent the day sharing a quite remarkable story with us, one that we've been working to verify through various channels. Before we proceed further, we believe you should hear it directly from her." David took the indicated seat, his eyes never leaving Elise's face. "I'm listening." Elise took a measured breath. "Wilhelm was not who any of you thought he was," she began. "His official role in German intelligence was real, but it was not his only allegiance. Since 1941, he had been working with a network of Germans who recognized the evil of the regime and were actively working against it from within." David stared at her, trying to absorb this unexpected claim. A resistance member, within German military intelligence? Yes, there were more of us than history may ever acknowledge. People in positions throughout the government and military who saw what was happening and tried to mitigate the damage where they could. Wilhelm used his position to warn potential targets when possible, to misdirect resources, to preserve information that would otherwise have been destroyed. One of the officials at the table, a stern-looking woman with steel-grey hair, interjected, "We have been able to confirm parts of Mrs. Miller's account through other sources. Oberst Braun does appear on a list of contacts provided by Alan Dulles, who ran intelligence operations from Switzerland and worked with several German resistance networks." Elise continued, "In the final year, as Germany's defeat became inevitable, Wilhelm's focus shifted. He realized that enormous amounts of wealth had been confiscated from civilians, particularly Jewish families, and funneled through various official and unofficial channels. He began tracking these assets, documenting their origins and their movement through the financial system." "The Swiss bank visits," David said, beginning to understand. Elise nodded. "Wilhelm was creating a record, gathering account numbers, transaction histories, signatures of officials involved. The silver bracelet he gave me." She touched her wrist reflexively, though she wasn't wearing it today. "The inside contained more than just my initials. There's a tiny sequence of numbers engraved so small you need a magnifying glass to read them clearly. Access codes to a specific vault in Zurich." "And you knew all this from the beginning?" "Not from the very beginning of his involvement, no. Wilhelm protected me from that knowledge initially, but by 1944, as the situation in Germany deteriorated, he began to prepare me. He knew his position was becoming increasingly dangerous. He needed someone else to carry his information if something happened to him." Colonel Masterson leaned forward. "What Mrs. Miller has provided us today is extraordinary, Lieutenant. A comprehensive map of financial transactions involving looted assets, identifying not only accounts and amounts, but the officials who facilitated the transfers, some of whom are currently presenting themselves as innocent bureaucrats who were just following orders. If Wilhelm was working against the regime, why didn't he share this with the Allies immediately after the war ended? Why the secrecy?" David asked. A shadow crossed Elise's face. "He intended to. He was making arrangements to contact Allied authorities when he was eliminated. Wilhelm had enemies on multiple sides, those within the German hierarchy who suspected his divided loyalties, and others who feared what he knew about their financial dealings. After he was gone, I was alone with this dangerous knowledge, uncertain whom to trust." "So when we met in Dresden," David began, "I was cautious. Terrified, actually, though I tried not to show it. I had what might be the most dangerous financial intelligence to emerge from the conflict, with no idea how to use it safely. When you approached me, When I recognized you were American intelligence despite your cover story, I saw a potential path forward. Her eyes held his steadily. I needed to determine if you were someone who would use this information properly to help restore what was stolen, rather than simply appropriate it for American interests. The implications of what she was saying began to dawn on David. The scientists and research materials, that was real intelligence, but it wasn't the most valuable information you had. No, it wasn't. But it was something I could share to build trust, to observe how it would be handled. A hint of a smile touched her lips. You proved yourself, David, not just as an intelligence officer, but as a man of principle. That's why I agreed to marry you, not solely for protection or passage to America, though those were factors. I married you because I came to believe you were someone who would help me complete Wilhelm's mission. David felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that Elise had not been complicit in crimes, amazement at the courage it must have taken to carry such a burden alone, and a touch of professional chagrin that she had essentially been running her own intelligence operation with him as the target. Why not tell me the full truth once we were in America? Why wait until you were confronted with the photographs? Habits of caution are hard to break, she replied simply, and the stakes are enormously high. This information could help restore billions in assets to survivors or their families. It could also implicate powerful people who are currently rebuilding their lives and reputations in post-war Europe. I needed absolute certainty before sharing it, even with you. Colonel Masterson cleared his throat. We've spent the day reviewing the initial documentation Mrs. Miller has provided. Its authenticity appears solid, and its implications are significant. This may be the most comprehensive record of financial crimes committed during the conflict that has yet come to light. What happens now? David asked, looking around at the officials and then back to Elise. That depends partly on your wife's continued cooperation, Masterson replied. This information will need to be carefully managed. There are diplomatic considerations, ongoing negotiations with Swiss authorities, questions of jurisdiction, and process for potential recovery efforts. I've cooperated fully today, Elise said, and I will continue to do so, with one condition. Her gaze was unwavering as she looked at the senior officials. This information must be used for its intended purpose, to identify and restore stolen assets to their rightful owners or their surviving family members. Not as leverage for political objectives, not as a tool to secure advantage for any single nation, and not as a means to grant immunity to those who were complicit in exchange for other forms of cooperation. The officials exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the firmness of her position. David felt a surge of pride in Elise's courage, along with a newfound understanding of the moral complexity she had been navigating all along. Those terms are ambitious, Mrs. Miller, Masterson said carefully. International financial matters are rarely straightforward, especially in the current climate. Nevertheless, those are my terms, Elise replied calmly. Wilhelm didn't risk his life gathering this information so it could disappear into government archives or be used as a bargaining chip in geopolitical negotiations. He believed the victims deserved justice, even if it came too late for many of them. I share that belief. After a long moment, Masterson nodded. Your position is noted, Mrs. Miller. I can assure you that there are many within our government who would support the principle you're advocating, myself included. While I can't promise the process will be simple or swift, I believe we can work together toward that goal. The meeting continued for another hour, with arrangements made for Elise to work with a specialized team to fully document and analyze the financial intelligence she possessed. When they were finally permitted to leave, David and Elise stepped out into the early evening air, both emotionally and physically exhausted. I'd like to walk for a while if that's all right, Elise said. I've been sitting in that room all day. David nodded, and they made their way slowly through the streets of Washington, the city glowing with early Christmas decorations that seemed incongruously cheerful after the intensity of the day's revelations. Neither spoke until they reached a small park, where they found a bench beneath a street lamp. I owe you an apology, Elise said finally, for not trusting you with the complete truth sooner. David shook his head. No, you were protecting something vitally important. You made the decisions you thought necessary. He took her hand, turning to face her directly. But now that everything is in the open, I need to ask, was any of it real? Your feelings for me, our life together, was that all part of your mission too? Elise's expression softened. David, my feelings for you are the most genuine thing in my life right now. When I agreed to marry you in Dresden, it was primarily strategic, yes, but every day since then, every conversation, every shared meal, every night in your arms, that has been real. More real than anything I experienced during the years of living with secrets and fear. Even though your first husband was a good man, a hero from what you've told us today, a complicated emotion crossed her face. Wilhelm was a good man in extraordinary circumstances, making impossible choices. I respected him deeply for his courage and principles. But our marriage was always more of a partnership than a love match. What he and I shared was a commitment to doing what was right in a world gone terribly wrong. She squeezed David's hand. What you and I have built together is something different, something I never expected to find amid all this chaos and loss. David felt the tension he had been carrying begin to ease. So where do we go from here? Forward, I hope. There will be months of work ahead with the financial investigators. It won't be easy or simple. Some of the people implicated in Wilhelm's documentation are powerful, with new identities and positions. Others are already working with American agencies in various capacities. The politics will be challenging. You don't have to face that alone, David said. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together. For the first time that day, Elise's composed facade cracked slightly, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. I've been carrying this alone for so long, even before Wilhelm died, the weight of secrecy, of constant vigilance. It's exhausting in ways I can barely express. David pulled her close, feeling her shoulders tremble slightly as she allowed herself, perhaps for the first time since the conflict had begun, to release some of the burden she had been carrying. You're not alone anymore, he whispered against her hair. And what you've done, what Wilhelm started and you've completed, it matters. It will make a difference for so many families who lost everything. Over the months that followed, David watched in admiration as Elise worked tirelessly with a specialized team of financial investigators, legal experts and diplomats to unravel the complex web of transactions documented in Wilhelm Braun's meticulous records. The silver bracelet's hidden code had indeed led to a Swiss vault containing microfilm, account ledgers, and correspondence that provided irrefutable evidence of systematic financial crimes involving billions in confiscated assets. The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Swiss banking laws created obstacles. Political considerations sometimes slowed progress. Certain officials named in the documents had already established new lives and careers, some even working with allied governments in the emerging Cold Conflict against the Soviets. Their complicity in financial crimes complicated international relationships at a time when Western solidarity was increasingly prioritized. Throughout it all, Elise remained steadfast in her insistence that justice for the victims must take precedence over political expedience. Her moral clarity earned her both powerful allies and enemies within the American government and among international stakeholders. More than once, David found himself using his position and connections to protect her from those who would prefer to see Wilhelm Braun's evidence quietly buried. By the summer of 1946, the first tangible results of their efforts began to materialize. A specialized international commission was established to trace ownership of confiscated assets and facilitate restitution. The initial cases involved art collections and monetary assets held in Swiss accounts, with successful transfers to surviving family members who had thought their heritage lost forever. "This letter came for you," David said one evening in August, handing Elise an envelope that had arrived at their apartment. They had moved to a larger place in spring, a symbolic fresh start as their lives together transitioned from strategic arrangement to genuine partnership. Elise opened it, her expression growing increasingly moved as she read. "It's from the Rothman family," she said finally. "The commission was able to restore their family's collection of Renaissance art and financial holdings. They write that their father spoke of these paintings until his final days, never believing they would be seen by his children again." She looked up, her eyes bright. "They want to meet me, to thank me in person." "Wilhelm would be proud," David said gently. "His work is bearing fruit." "Our work?" Elise corrected him. "I couldn't have done this without you, David." He smiled, thinking of how far they had come from their first meeting in the ruins of Dresden. Partners in every sense, then. In September, an unexpected development brought their journey full circle. David was summoned to Dr. Jenkins' office, where he found his superior looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "We've received a communication from Soviet intelligence," Jenkins said without preamble. "It seems they've been following your wife's restitution work with great interest. They have a proposal, and a revelation I think you should hear directly from them." A meeting was arranged at a neutral diplomatic location. David and Elise attended together, accompanied by Colonel Masterson and 2 State Department representatives. The Soviet delegation consisted of 3 stern-faced men who regarded them with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. "Mrs. Miller," the senior Soviet official began, his English precise but heavily accented, "your work recovering financial assets has been noted by my government. We have similar interests regarding certain accounts that involve property taken from regions now under Soviet administration. My concern is with returning assets to the individuals and families from whom they were stolen," Elise replied carefully. "Not to governments." The Russian nodded. "This is understood. However, in the course of our own investigations, we have come across information that may be of personal significance to you." He opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "This report concerns the circumstances of Oberst Wilhelm Braun's death." Elise took the paper, reading it quickly, her face paling. "This says Wilhelm wasn't killed by German security forces as I was told. According to this, he surrendered to an American intelligence unit 3 days before Dresden fell, offering his documentation on financial crimes in exchange for protection." She looked up sharply. "And then he died while in American custody? How is that possible?" All eyes turned to Colonel Masterson, whose expression had grown guarded. "This is the first I've heard of such an incident, Mrs. Miller. If an American unit was involved—" "It was not an official American operation," the Russian interrupted. "According to our intelligence, it was a specialized team working directly for certain banking interests in the West, individuals who stood to lose considerably if Oberst Braun's evidence became public. They used American uniforms and identification, but were effectively private contractors." The revelation hung in the air like a thundercloud. David watched Elise absorb this information, saw her connecting dots that had previously remained separate in her mind. "The colonel who requisitioned our house in Dresden," she said slowly. "He was unusually interested in Wilhelm's papers, his contacts. He claimed to be conducting standard occupation procedures, but his questions were specific, about Switzerland, about financial transactions." Her eyes widened. "He knew. He was looking for what Wilhelm had hidden, what I later showed to you." The Russian nodded. "We believe this same network has continued operating, attempting to locate and neutralize Braun's evidence. They have been somewhat frustrated by your successful work with official American channels." Colonel Masterson leaned forward. "If you have names, details of this operation, we do, and we are prepared to share this information, along with additional evidence our agents recovered from Berlin regarding specific accounts. In exchange, we ask for cooperative effort on cases involving assets taken from territories now under Soviet influence." The Russian's expression remained impassive. "Not for political purposes, as Mrs. Miller would say, but for the same principles of justice she has championed." The meeting continued for hours, evolving into a careful diplomatic dance around competing interests, unified only by the common thread of Wilhelm Braun's evidence. When they finally emerged, David and Elise walked silently to their car, both processing the implications of what they had learned. "All this time," Elise said finally as David drove them home, "I believed Wilhelm died at the hands of the regime he had been working against. To learn that he was killed by the very financial interests he was trying to expose." "It's a testament to how important his work was," David replied, "how threatening to powerful people who thought they had escaped accountability. And now the Soviets are offering cooperation." The world has become very strange, hasn't it? Her voice held a note of bitter irony. Former enemies working together to address crimes committed by people who wear friendly faces and hold respected positions. Justice makes for unexpected alliances, David observed. The question is whether we can trust their motives or information. Elise was quiet for a long moment. We verify everything, of course, but we also use whatever legitimate tools become available. The people Wilhelm was trying to help deserve nothing less. She turned to look at him. This work may never truly be finished, David. There's so much still to uncover, so many accounts to trace, so many families still searching for what was taken from them. Then we'll continue for as long as it takes, he said simply. One case at a time, one family at a time. The work did indeed continue, expanding in scope as more evidence emerged and more governments reluctantly opened their records. By 1948, the International Commission Elise had helped establish had successfully resolved hundreds of cases, returning artwork, jewelry, financial assets and property to survivors or their descendants. Each successful restitution represented not just material recovery, but a small measure of justice in a world still struggling to reckon with the immense human and moral damage of the conflict. The revelation about Wilhelm's death led to an investigation that ultimately identified 3 of the men responsible, former banking officials who had worked with German financial institutions during the occupation of various European territories. Their prosecution became one of the lesser-known but significant legal proceedings of the post-war period, establishing precedent for financial crimes being treated as war crimes under certain circumstances. For David and Elise, the work became their shared mission, transforming what had begun as an intelligence operation and a marriage of convenience into a lifelong partnership dedicated to a cause larger than themselves. Their personal happiness deepened alongside their professional collaboration, each strengthening the other. On a crisp autumn day in 1949, they stood together in a small museum in New York, where a collection of recovered paintings was being unveiled for the first time since before the war. The elderly woman beside them wept quietly as she gazed at a landscape that had hung in her family's home for generations before being confiscated in 1939. "My father said I would see these again one day," she told Elise, clasping her hand tightly. "I thought it was just the hope of a dying man." But he was right. Elise smiled gently. "Sometimes hope is all we have to hold on to. I'm grateful your father's faith was rewarded." Later, as they walked through Central Park, the autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and crimson beneath their feet, David reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "When I was sent to Dresden to find scientific secrets, I never imagined I'd instead discover a financial conspiracy, marry a German widow, and spend years working on art restitution," he said with a touch of wonder in his voice. Elise slipped her arm through his. "And I never imagined that the American intelligence officer pretending to be German would become the most honest and trustworthy person in my life." Her expression grew thoughtful. "We began with so many layers of deception between us, your cover identity, my hidden knowledge, yet somehow we found truth together. Perhaps that's what drew us to each other from the beginning," David suggested. "Some recognition that beneath the necessary lies of wartime, there was a shared commitment to what matters most. Justice," Elise said, "accountability, remembrance, and love," David added softly. "Don't forget that part." She smiled, leaning into his embrace as they continued their walk. "Never. It's what makes all the rest worthwhile." In the years that followed, David and Elise Miller would continue their work, establishing a foundation dedicated to tracing and recovering lost assets from the conflict era. Their efforts would help thousands of families reclaim pieces of their heritage and history, while also creating important legal precedents for addressing financial crimes during international conflicts. Their partnership, personal and professional, would stand as testament to how unexpected connections forged in the aftermath of humanity's darkest chapter could help illuminate the path toward healing and justice. Their story would never make headlines or feature prominently in history books. The most meaningful work rarely does, but in living rooms across Europe and America, in the modest apartments of survivors and the homes of their descendants, Paintings hung on walls, heirlooms sat on mantels, and family treasures were once again passed from generation to generation because of what began when an American intelligence officer met a German widow in the ruins of Dresden in 1945. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.